What is the oceanic reality of global maritime trade? We are taught that Columbus had 4 voyages, but not that his last 2 were failures. After his 3rd journey, he never returns to Spain as a captain. He and his brothers are sent back to Spain in chains after the 3rd voyage because the colony rises up in rebellion against him. When the Spanish crown grants release, he's allowed one last ride, but his ships fall apart off the coast of Jamaica. Conquistadors burn their ships, leaving no retreat, forcing the crew to conquer. They actually stripped all metal from their vessels and scuttled them. The ships are falling apart. History textbooks deceptively claim that when Spain finally sailed across the Pacific Ocean, that they created the world's first true global trade network. The real age of sail had been happening for thousands of years in Moananuiākea. The Pacific water body is 1/3 the total surface of the Earth. It connects all land on it, which also fits within it. This is the water highway, the largest trade route in the world. Europeans are late to the age of sail. If you follow the money and the labor when the West finally does cross the Pacific regularly, we see a completely different story. The Ottomans have the Mediterranean locked up. Muslims are enslaving surrounding populations. European companies run to the New World to escape and do the same thing. Seeing Spain's success, enslaving American Indians for Christ, rival European powers want a piece of the action. The English East India Company, the EIC, is formed in 1600 to break the Portuguese monopoly in the Spice Islands. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, follows suit in 1602 for the same reason. Company documents show and record the same issues with European oak while at war with Spain. After a few months, the Teredo shipworm turns European ship hulls into a sponge. This causes shipbuilders to place a sacrificial pine layer around it to extend the life of a ship. Since biblical times, they've been undergirding these weak ships to keep them together. Wrapping a ship in heavy rope to keep it from falling apart is so common it's called frapping by the time the East Indiamen sail. Europeans had abandoned the sewn plank tech that's perfected in the Pacific. History says Africa, Asia, and Europe all adopt new designs to war with Rome. Tonnage and war materials run through the Mediterranean to supply the land wars. We see how backwards this is when we look at ship design versus payload and the amount of crew necessary to make it all work. The difference between the rigid land mindset versus the fluid mindset of the ocean is clear. In 1617, a Spanish royal decree ordered the construction of a massive shipyard in Havana. This project takes over 100 years to complete. But as war rages between Spain and the Netherlands, a new corporate war machine is born. The Dutch launched their grand design, aiming to seize Spanish colonial claims as New Netherland. At the heart of the strategy is the Dutch West India Company, incorporated in 1621. The WIC built its empire on salt raids and human trafficking, targeting both American Indian towns and Spanish settlements. Dutch privateers trapped Spanish silver ships, but the true profits come from the ongoing salt rush and the enslavement of Aboriginal peoples across the Caribbean. This labor funded the WIC's global enterprises, from sugar plantations in Brazil to the continent's expanding fur trade, anchored at their new capital, New Amsterdam, which is known today as New York. In Havana, the Spanish crafted ships from American hardwoods like Cuban mahogany and Guayacán wood. The unforgiving tropical oceans demand the hardware used in the Pacific for countless generations. That's why Spain's most critical shipyards aren't even in Europe. They're positioned in the Pacific. One in Cavite, in the Philippines, the other in Guayaquil, Ecuador. Even with the world's best materials, maintaining these ships is a nightmare. The distance between these two ports is over 10,000 miles. 100 years after Columbus, the famous Manila Galleons, circulating the world currency of Spanish pieces of 8, are actually built and crewed by Filipinos. They're not just doing the heavy lifting as basic sailors. If the Filipinos are not the pilots, how did the lost Spanish captains actually traverse the Pacific? They didn't possess the right software. Instead, they're in the habit of outsourcing. The ancient program of the Pacific had been running for thousands of years, and Europeans are outsourcing the hardware. They also outsourced the correct software. This wasn't just true for Spain. Every European empire operated this way. European captains usually had no family or cultural connection to the men sailing their ships. Corporations use vague, lazy labels describing their domestic crews as Chinos, Lascars, Chinese artisans, or Asiatics. These generic terms are used to hide the truth. The ancient machinery of the Pacific requires Pacific material. Foreign entrance is malware. Spain did not actually own or control the silver mines of Amaruca. What they did truly control was a monopoly on mercury, shipping, and most importantly, labor. At the time, mercury was essential to process silver. The largest supply came from the mines of Huancavelica. To extract it, they enslaved, traded, and occasionally paid American Indians for the grueling labor. This was the blueprint. They ran the exact same scheme for silver mining, again to force the massive manpower needed to run a few heavily guarded ports. In doing so, the Spanish crown poisoned entire regions, from the mercury mines of Peru to the silver purification centers of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia. The New World was producing the bulk of the global silver supply, and Spain did everything in its power to capture every single piece of it. Spain's desperate hunger for labor was concentrated directly around the silver mines. To handle the Caribbean, they outsourced the slave trade entirely through the royal contracts known as the asiento. When Spain grants this monopoly to Portuguese merchants during the Iberian Union, the Dutch attack. Through aggressive privateering and illicit shadow networks, the Dutch siphon off traffic, positioning themselves as new power players of the Atlantic routes. It takes a different force to move a third of the world's silver supply. Spain was on a permanent war footing, launching a massive armada, heavily armed warships called the Flota de Indias, the Spanish treasure fleet. Their sole mission is to guard cargo ships from Mexico and Peru. This network anchored at Veracruz and Portobello. After a final careen and safety check in Havana, the fleet would turn east with New World riches and head back to Spain. To exploit Indian teak, labor, and naval infrastructure, the English EIC shift their main long-distance shipbuilding operations to Bombay, modern-day Mumbai. These native materials outlasted European oak 4 times over. On the other side of Hindustan, the Dutch VOC built their shipyards at Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, and the island of Onrust. To maintain their fleets, they enslave and leverage debt bonding on local laborers. The British and Dutch privateers, the illegal shadow fleets, constantly raid and harass the Atlantic silver route. This business required aboriginal labor and salt, and the Pacific route was an isolated proving ground that required the same thing. A single Spanish galleon made the voyage across the Pacific each year, but that one ship carried a huge profit. Looking closely at the Pacific corridor reveals a massive gap between what the Spanish Empire claimed it controlled and what was actually happening on the water. The Filipino-built ships flew a grand Spanish flag, but they lacked the proper protocol status and identity to legally drop anchor in Pacific proper under the ancient domestic maritime laws. This is not a failure of the crew. It's a failure of the flag. European operations did not hold regional kinship ties to the lands they're sailing through. Without a blood passport, the only option is to sail non-stop across the massive ocean. This is why the shipyard in Guayaquil is so indispensable. Galleons needed non-negotiable careening and repair. There is no return trip without it. Western historiography is tracking the wrong treasure. They glorify slavery for silver, perpetuating a man-made debt system. The true masters of the ocean traded in something far more vital for survival. Pa'akai, solid ocean, salt. When you look at the West's entrance into the age of sail, the truth becomes clear. Salt was the real engine of global trade and human survival. Spain knew this, anchoring a fortress at Araya Coast to lock down the Caribbean salt pans. In the Pacific, Te'ewhenui extended its reach into everything. When empires clash and trade routes expand, salt, not silver, is king. Once the West stumbles into the Pacific, the game changes. By weaponizing this vital resource directly for black powder and heavy armaments, King Kamehameha shatters the illusion of Western dominance, turning desperate drug traffickers and rival empires into mere puppets to Hawaiian foreign policy, locking Spain out of the Pacific Rim.